So, guys, this talk is on modernism. Are you surprised?
Ooh.
Now we're talking.
And how to evangelize modernists. So, first thing, my first point is basically modernists refers to pretty much our whole society. And it's also not just a problem for the church. It's something you see in secular society as well, especially in like the realm of education, for example. See a lot of the same problems that the church is having with modernistic attitudes. I'll talk a little bit about that, but basically the main focus of the talk is on modernism and its root causes and attitudes, and the vices that are associated with it, and the virtues that are counter to it, and how that relates to evangelizing to modernists. Excuse me while I scroll down for more talking points. So, first I'm going to talk about what is modernism, and I wrote a lot about this in my St. Pius X post, obviously because he's one of the strongest forces against modernism in the church, and one of the best patrons of Team Orthodoxy. So, modernism, as I said in that blog, is not the same as modern art, but there are some parallels between them. Modern art is a field where you can display your own feces and call it art, just as valid as any other piece of art. And modernism, very similarly, is a field where you can deny truth itself and call it philosophy. You can dream up the most inhuman philosophies and put them on a pedestal beside Christianity, or even higher than it. And so, basically, the central point of modernism is rebellion. Rebellion against legitimate authority. So, I have a quote from this guy that we kind of like. His name is G.K. Chesterton. I'm going to drink water first to increase the suspense. Okay, Chesterton says, tradition means giving votes to the most obscure of all classes, our ancestors. It is the democracy of the dead. Tradition refuses to submit to the small and arrogant oligarchy of those who merely happen to be walking about. Modernism is just that arrogant oligarchy of the present time. That's why the pedestal full of filth, which is modernist philosophy, is held higher than the teachings of the church, because it's the thoughts and philosophies dreamed up by this generation, and it's a generation that has a scorn for their ancestors, basically. Anything that didn't originate with us is considered less. Yeah, so basically it's like, whereas the church would encourage us to accept and learn from the wisdom of the past, modernism is all about what we dream up now and setting off on kind of like a hasty course without considering what those who have come before. So modernism, it affects more than just the relationship of a person to the church. It actually is a vice that deeply affects a person's whole life. And I mentioned the issue with education. This is something I've been talking about with a friend who's a prof at Waterloo, and talking about the problem of students coming into university, and how in our generation especially, the quality of them is just going off a cliff. And a lot of that, I believe, is because of modernistic attitudes in our education system. The same way as you can put such a terrible philosophy on a pedestal with a good philosophy and say they're equal, the same thing goes in teachings in schools. And, I mean, you see the same kind of symptoms there as you do in modernism relating to the church. You see rebellion against authority. You see a lack of discipline, lack of motivation, lack of objectivity. You see a deeply ingrained entitlement complex, where students feel that, even if they don't put in the effort or don't understand anything, they deserve to pass, deserve to move on, deserve to go to university, whatever it is. And this is the same thing I see a lot in, discussions with various people who kind of subscribe to the modernist ideals, whether it's, apostate Catholics, or even looking at my own attitudes when I choose to sin. It's the same kind of attitude that even I have. And it's that whole attitude of entitlement. And it comes straight from pride. It's when you say to yourself, I deserve this. And really, you don't. In our society, we have a huge problem with that. I mean, you get this when you talk about, say, contraception or something, and people will say stuff like, well, I use contraception, so if I get pregnant, it's not my fault. I should just be able to have an abortion, because they feel entitled to the right to have sex or whatever, entitled to be free of children. So the two particular vices that I've observed as being kind of characteristic of modernism are pride and disobedience. And that's why I'm going to talk a little bit about counter virtues to these: humility and obedience. So, first, a blurb on obedience, and a quote from St. Catherine of Siena. She said, "Oh, how sweet and glorious is this virtue of obedience, which contains all the other virtues. Because it is born of charity, and on the rock of the holy faith is founded. It is a queen, and he who espouses it knows no evil, but only peace and rest." So the key point St. Catherine said is obedience is born of charity. I think this is true in a couple of senses, that it requires charity of us to actually obey rather than follow our own will. It's an act of self-sacrifice, which is basically the definition of charity. And you see this example in Philippians 2:8. It says Jesus was obedient unto death, even death on a cross. So he shows us that virtue. And in the Catechism it says that Jesus substituted his obedience to the will of the Father for the disobedience of sin. So obviously obedience is a key virtue for us in fighting modernism in our own heart, and also being an example against it. And the other sense that obedience is born of charity is the fact that it's actually a gift of God's love, in that it gives us, the weak-willed and the sometimes ignorant and unknowledgeable, a way to actually live the Christian life. Because sometimes, we're not all scholars, and we don't all have a deep understanding of theology. God gives us the gift of the church and the gift of leaders to allow us to be able to do the right thing and live the Christian life just by obeying the church that he gave us. So it makes it easier for us to be virtuous just by having this one virtue. Okay, now on to humility. A quote from Mike Strauss: "Humility from the book of Humility."
Can you say that again?
Mike Strauss once said, "Humility is one of my greatest virtues." Oh, but in all seriousness, I have a St. Augustine quote. So St. Augustine said, "Do you wish to rise, begin by descending. you plan a tower that will pierce the clouds, lay first the foundation of humility. And that's very true. In the fight against modernism, it's just like that tall tower that will pierce the clouds. It's a very lofty goal, thinking of defeating modernism. Because in my mind, and also according to certain popes and saints, modernism is basically nothing less than Satan's primary plan for destroying human souls at this time in history. So when we think about defeating that, we have to realize that we can't defeat it. Only God can. So that's where we have to start with humility and know that the only way we're ever going to prevail against modernism is actually by begging God to defeat it for us and being willing to be our part, our small part in the plan. Because we're tiny. The other thing that's important about humility is when talking to modernists, there's a lot of shaming tactics. I think you guys all know what I'm talking about, where, you're called out as being intolerant or being sexist, or that, people are going to hate you for speaking out against modernist ideas. And humility kind of renders us immune to a lot of the effects of this. If, you're not taking to heart the idea that people are going to dislike me or think less of me. Humility is basically the antidote to this. And it allows you to remain objective, especially in conversations where you're likely to be insulted. And it allows you to also see through a lot of the modernist arguments, again, because they're based on that idea of entitlement. And when you're living the virtue of humility, then it becomes apparent the flaws in these arguments, right? Just like the one I mentioned earlier about contraception. So, some strategies for evangelizing modernists. So, according to Pope Pius X, the most successful element of the modernist increase in our society is the manipulation of public opinion. And he said in his encyclical Pascendi Gregis, my Latin's terrible. Anyways, in one of his encyclicals he says about modernists, the boundless effrontery of these men. Let one but open his mouth and the others applaud him in chorus, proclaiming that science has made another step forward. Let an outsider but hint at a desire to inspect the new discovery with his own eyes, and they are on him in a body. Deny it and you're an ignoramus. Embrace and defend it, and there is no praise too warm for you. In this way they win over any who, did they but realize what they were doing, would shrink back in horror. So the tactic largely used was for opponents who come out with sound arguments. They surround them in silence, ignore them, and refuse to engage. And then they talk up each other, right? So then in the eyes of the public, you see a huge swarm of public opinion, all supporting these modernist ideas. And currently we're at a point in our society where any person who argues against popular modernist ideas is going to find himself silenced by the media, denied from public opinion, public positions, and largely ignored by anyone of influence. Even if that influential person might agree, there's such pressure on them to maintain that position that usually they're afraid. So, I'm thinking about this. One major thing we need to do to counter this, obviously, is to fight back in the public sphere. We need to be organized and supporting our fellow Catholics. And this is something Catholics are starting to do, cross-promoting each other, especially on the internet. But, we're about 40 years behind the first modernist writers who started doing this, right? So, in the war of public opinion, obviously, Catholics are way behind. but it's something that we do need to do, supporting fellow Catholic writers and bloggers. And in the end, I mean, there's no substitute for constantly being at prayer and working hard, both on public communication like blogs and on just individual communication with the people in our lives. So, some advice for individual encounters with modernists. I found one of the key weaknesses that I have is being afraid in these kinds of encounters. So, I mean, a lot of modernists are very confrontational, very insulting, very belittling, and they use these tactics of, labeling you and kind of implicitly threatening you with these social repercussions, right? So the best advice is JP2's catchphrase, do not be afraid. Because in reality, modernism is just all hot air. There's no logical basis for it. There's no foundation for it. It's all just bluster and, trickery in conversation, really. And as I said before, this is where humility comes in to allow us to accept these consequences and these insults and labels and whatever, and to continue to stand up for the truth. 1 second, I need water. Water is so good. Okay. So, stop laughing at me, Brooke. Humility. I need it to talk to Brooke. So there's a couple of tactics always to watch out for, and the first I've been talking about a lot is intimidation, and that's pretty straightforward. That's where they label you as intolerant and sexist and homophobic and all these other words, wanting to take away people's freedom and oppress them and stuff. And basically it's just their implication is, stop arguing against our ideas, or else you're going to lose friends and jobs and opportunities, and you're going to be hated, essentially. So, I mean, the only counter to this is to be constantly at prayer and praying for the virtue of humility. And, in our society, this is the way that Christians are oppressed by our society. I mean, in other times and other places, Christians are violently attacked. In our time, they're attacked like this, with, this kind of social shunning and threats. So, I mean, we need to pray just as hard for strength to resist that as someone needs to pray who's being threatened with execution for their faith. And, okay, another strategy to watch out for is the misdirection and topic switching. We see this a lot with certain friends that we talk to on Facebook a lot. Just in order to talk to a modernist, you need to keep them on track, because it's all about misdirection. There's I was reading this article about modernism. I forget the quote now, but it's something like, when truth is not the measure of your philosophy, then there's no choice but to seek other palliatives to make it work, right? And so, honestly, for modernists, this usually involves running around from topic to topic, never letting any conversation go to its logical conclusion. Always just keep you running in circles so you won't see that their arguments are full of holes. As soon as you point out a hole, they'll change the topic to something else so they won't be caught. I mean, all you need to do is just don't answer the stuff that they keep changing topics to. Keep on one topic, and can't argue because there's nothing behind the philosophy. Okay, so one last piece of advice for modernists in the church. For example, this group called Chickens for Nuggets, otherwise known as Catholics for Choice. I found engaging these people, it's so tempting just to throw angry responses at them, in essence, like just telling them to leave the church. But this really doesn't do that much good. Probably does more harm than good. The thing to remember is that the focus should be on actually showing that the church is right and trying to bring people to the truth rather than just getting them to stop annoying you, even though they can be really annoying. Yeah, and finally, probably the best advice is that it's not all just about arguing with modernists. We need to be a living example of why living in the truth is actually superior. So I'll end with just mentioning, don't be one of those sour-faced saints that St. Teresa of Avila spoke of, who fight to uphold orthodoxy but didn't actually love God in their hearts. So our love is always going to be a better witness than our arguments. And yeah, that's it. Modernism sucks.